Hello and welcome to this screencast on States and Societies of Sub-Saharan Africa, Chapter 18 in Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. This covers the whole time period from 600 CE to about 1450 CE. So after the fall of the classical empires in the Mediterranean and South Asia and East Asia, and then before the global maritime connections brought on by voyages from Iberia. Unlike with Europe and China, Bentley and Ziegler devote just one chapter to this whole time period for Africa, as opposed to two, and then for China and Europe, parts of three chapters are covered with that. So that's a way of saying there's a lot in here. And Africa, of course, is very large, and so these societies are connected to the broader world. They're connected to each other, but there's also some pretty strong regional differences. So what I'm going to do here is break down for you what are the most important things to keep in mind as you're reading through chapter 18. The big idea, as is often the case in this time period, involves trade. So remember, that's the first and the most important key concept for this time period is expanding interactions, expanding networks of exchange. And there's two important ones that connected Africa to the broader world of the Eastern Hemisphere. And it's one of the reasons why we say Afro-Eurasia and world history, because these places are connected. Those connections generated wealth, brought culture, especially Islam, to Africa. And by culture, I don't mean there was culture there, but brought a new important cultural element further into Africa in the form of Islam, and then generated more substantial states. And there's a real variety in those states too. So this map's from the book, and looking at it could really take you a long ways in understanding what's going on. As you are thinking about this, you should think of there's a triangle here where these three factors influence each other. So ruling elites were most often the group that would adopt Islam as it came in as a way to forge diplomatic connections, but also merchants would adopt Islam as a way to make connections with people, traders in the Islamic societies that they're in contact with. So as you look at this map here, if we go back to the previous one here, looking at this map, you can see that the direct connections for trade and exchange are into Dar al-Islam. So North Africa was Islamic, and so West Africa had been connected to that for a long time. As those connections deepened, that was during a time when this area was becoming more Islamic, and so Islam came in. Same thing here along the Indian Ocean. The Western Indian Ocean here included Arabia and Persia. Okay, so not everywhere becomes Islamic, though. Ethiopia is one of the oldest and most enduring Christian states in the world. So there's going to be a connection between these three things, and that's a way to think analytically, make connections between things. All right, two big exchange networks that are really important to commit to memory for world history students. And those are the trans-Saharan trade routes, so across the Sahara, so between North Africa and West Africa. And you can see the products that are going in and out under exporting and importing. Camel saddles are important for that because the desert made travel by camel the most practical. Camels also big and can transport more items and then do better in the desert than donkeys, which also would have been used, and horses. So the development of the camel saddle just a little bit before this time period, maybe in the 4th century CE, which is going to lead to growth in this trade network. And then in the Indian Ocean, you can see the what's being traded out. And there also would have been, enslaved people are being trafficked in both of these networks, and then other products, including, you see gold and ivory in both places, ivory from elephant and rhinoceros tusks going out. Okay. And there's evidence of this, like porcelain, that's found in East Africa, archaeological evidence that is showing that. So Indian Ocean networks, which have already been covered in chapter 15 and are a big topic. And now you're adding trans-Saharan trade networks to your understanding of exchange. So we have Silk Roads, Trans-Saharan, and Indian Ocean. And these things are connected to each other through in places like Cairo, and they're also networked into the Mediterranean where there's a lot of trade. Oh, there I am. Hey. This is a video which I will not play for you, but you can find fairly easily on the salt trade. Now, salt is really important. And so in West Africa, one example of these trade networks was that the salt trade was a big part of what was happening. So you could watch that video if you want. Okay. So here's what I was mentioning before. In East Africa, in addition to absorbing Islam from the broader world, a new language and culture developed, Swahili. And Swahili is an African language, but it contains words in it from other languages. So it was used to communicate across cultures. In this way, it's a lot like English, which includes words from lots of different languages. So Swahili is basically a Bantu language, or is a Bantu language, so it has things in common with lots of other African languages. It's a language family, Bantu, but includes words from Arabic and Hindi and Persian as some examples that are a result of this cultural exchange across the Indian Ocean. And then, I've already mentioned with Islam, in West Africa, the rulers there who grew wealthy from the gold and salt trade that passed through their realm, those rulers supported Islamic scholarship, and so there were libraries. So it's not just that Islam came to West Africa, like that happened. West Africa became Muslim later than other places, but before many other places became Islamic. But it's also that West Africans contributed to Islamic scholarship, and by supporting, amongst other things, libraries where Islamic texts in Arabic were stored, and then new things were written. In terms of state forms, the most important new states to read for are West African empires that were part of this gold and salt trade. An important thing to know is that the gold and salt were not mined in Mali, as an example. So Mali would be the most prominent example of an empire from this time period. And Mansa Musa, or Emperor Moses, would have been one of the most famous rulers from this time period. So you really want to commit those to memory: Mali, Mansa Musa. The Mali Empire and the Ghana Empire that came before it, they built the wealth that supported their state on trade. An important thing to consider, as I was just saying, is that the gold and the salt that were at the heart of that trade were mined outside of their empires, but they were exchanged along with a lot of other products and trafficked human beings within the Empire of Mali itself. So this is a trading hub where gold from further south and salt from further north were key items in an exchange network that also included goods coming from a long way away. So Indian textiles, for example, made their way into West Africa. West African textiles made their way out. And most significantly for a world history class, the gold that was produced in West Africa became the basis for currency throughout, like the literal basis for currency, but turned into coins throughout Afro-Eurasia. This will be similar in the next time period after 1450, that silver from the Americas in what's today Peru and today Mexico, and also Peru and Bolivia, form the basis of the currency for global exchange. Here we have African gold providing the basis for hemispheric exchange. And so this image here shows us how people outside of West Africa, this is from a Spanish map maker, how they viewed West Africa and what was prominent there. Okay, so Mansa Musa and Mali are both really useful examples for students to know and use in their essays. Mansa Musa was a Muslim, so you got some alliteration there to help you out, and he made a famous Hajj, where he spent a lot of money and showcased his wealth on his way to Mecca. So that will also come up and be helpful for you. on the other side of the continent. So that was in West Africa. In East Africa, there are not large empires, but instead we have city-states. And that makes sense because, again, we're looking at more commerce. This is a commercial center. And these city-states promoted and taxed Indian Ocean trade. So they were supported from the taxation on the trade. Some of these places were actually islands just off the coast of Africa. You could see the mainland, but they're literally in the border zone between Africa and the Indian Ocean world. Swahili, as I mentioned, developed as a language for commerce. Again, it's important to know. Sometimes the book maybe might mislead on this a little bit. This is an African language, but it used some words from Arabic and Persian and Hindi and other languages, but as a way to that shows us that it was used to communicate across cultures. These places also became Islamic. Okay. So I mentioned Ethiopia is an exception to this trend of Islam spreading into Africa, although there are places in the modern nation of Ethiopia where people are Islamic. The kingdom of Ethiopia in the Middle Ages supported Christianity, including these super cool rock churches, which are carved out of solid rock into the ground, where people would go down into church and then they would emerge up out of the church. So going to and from a church service would also be an allegory for Christian theology about the death and rebirth of Jesus and people's eternal life or salvation. Things that Christians believe in. So it's like this really deep thing. It's shaped like a cross. You have that. Now you should know, though, Ethiopia became an empire, and Ethiopia is very diverse. Today, it's a large country, and there are many Muslims who live in Ethiopia. Now, in general, the book does a good job, though, of pointing out that these big kingdoms like Ethiopia and the West African empires are more the exception than the rule, and most of the continent is organized in smaller, much more decentralized units. So you should keep that in mind. We have one important instance of food moving. So remember, when food moves, that's always important. Like if the book notes it, it becomes the basis for things. So here we have bananas. Now, bananas are originally from Southeast Asia, the big island of New Guinea. And through the course of Indian Ocean trade, bananas spread to Central Africa, especially, where they are a staple food. Now, it's important to know, as I have in the bullets here, that these are not like the sweet breakfast kind of bananas that are often sold in the United States. They'd be more like plantains, which I imagine some of you have had. Starchier, less sweet, and then they would be picked green and then cooked. So it would function more in the dish, in the diet of people, in the dishes that make up the diet of people, like rice or potatoes, as a basic foodstuff, bread, that's going to sustain people and provide them with calories. That's called a staple food. But like in other places, the growth of the food supply leads to a bigger population, is going to contribute to greater complexity. Okay. The Bantu migration happens prior to that and is a theory of the spread of Bantu people through Bantu being a language, family, and culture through central into western and into southern Africa. And that culture, that group of people, as they spread, brought iron tools with them, which made agriculture more productive. So, like in a lot of places over this time period, new tools, metal tools, new foodstuffs are increasing food production, and that leads to more social complexity. Okay. Two last thoughts. The economic production category, the key concept, also includes social relations, like how those are conditioned on there. So one of the things to talk about is how slavery and the slave trade existed in Africa. And in some ways, this is going to be similar to other places where there's more or less slavery throughout Afro-Eurasia and in the Americas. There are societies without slaves, and there are societies with slaves. And most societies had some slavery in them, and that included most of the African societies. Slaves in all of these places, including in Africa, were both property. The idea of slavery is the idea that someone owned somebody else. But in Africa, slaves were also considered fully human. And this would also be true in other places, but it's important to note this now because of the changes that are going to come with the slave trade into the early modern period, the next time period. Oops, sorry. That said, the general expansion of trade and the general expansion of population and economic complexity during this time meant that the number of people being trafficked as slaves, including within Africa and out of Africa, is increasing during this time period. And you should see that as being related to the growth in economies and growth in exchange. An important thing to keep in mind with this, though, is that there's nothing like what we're going to see in the next time period. Societies like in the American places in the American South or in the Caribbean or in places in Brazil, where you have massive numbers of slaves, like in places like Jamaica, like 90% of the population is enslaved. There's nothing like that happening. And in general, slavery is a kind of social status, and it's not necessarily inherited. It's a whole different thing. This would also be true with slavery in some other places, but again, it's important to make that note here. The other thing that's interesting is that most places in Africa at this time were less patriarchal than some of the civilizations we've looked at in Europe, Western Europe, and East Asia. Now, that doesn't mean that they're matriarchal. So, one of the things in a history class is to always be kind of nuanced and not just go directly to the opposite. So, leadership was almost always male, but men often inherited through their sister, like through the family line that way. And as you read through here, you'll notice you should look for some ways that women have more social freedoms and economic influence than in some of the other societies that we've looked at. Again, not to like overcorrect and go all the way the other way, but also look for those differences. Okay. So this is a fascinating chapter, and it includes history that students often, unfortunately, have not learned enough about before. And so I look forward to hearing from some of you, and I wish the rest of you, well, and the students I'll hear from, all the best. All right. Take care.